This is Sandra Tanner, and you're listening to Gospel Tangents,
the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to do this throwback episode with Sandra Tanner. This is our interview from 2018, where I sat down with Sandra and we talked about how she and Gerald Tanner, her husband, figured out that the Salamander Letter was a fake. Now, they didn't think Mark Hofmann did it, but they did. But Gerald was the one who identified that it was fake, and so it's a fantastic story. And so I thought I would just share that with you. And so here you go. Well, welcome to Gospel Tangents Podcast. I'm here with Sandra Tanner. And can you tell us, are you famous or infamous in Mormon history?
both.
So how would most people know of you?
My husband and I have been critics of Mormonism since 1959 when we got married and started trying to resolve conflicts in our own minds in Mormonism. And we started publishing mimeograph stuff, if anyone knows what that is. I find young people don't even, when I say mimeograph, it's like blank. And anyways, back in 1959, we started mimeographing off little sheets of paper, pointing out historical discrepancies in Mormonism, which evolved into 64, setting up full-time publishing and printing on Mormonism. And we did a whole line of reprints of early Mormon historical books like The Times and Seasons, Evening and Morning Star, things like that, that any researcher would want to have access to. You have to remember, there was no internet. They were just starting to get photocopy machines in the libraries. So getting photos of early documents was a very hard thing. And you had to go to a library, so you'd have to sit there all day. So, I mean, it was very complicated back then to try to do research. Oh, here's an idea. We'll do photo reprints of all those early documents. Then you could buy them for a very cheap price, sit in your front room, and check out the references for yourself. So I've had this whole long history, my whole adult life, of writing, researching, printing on Mormonism. So whether I'm famous or infamous depends on your point of view, but we have been studying the history and doctrine of Mormonism since 1959.
Okay. So that's great. So I think most of my listeners are probably more towards the faithful side. And so I just wanted to make sure the idea behind Gospel Tangents, I want to kind of try to be as objective as possible. And so one of the things that I've always found interesting, I've been doing a lot of interviews with people on the Mark Hofmann bombings. And you knew Mark very well.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say very well, but we knew him. Yes, he stopped in a lot and talked with us.
Okay. So we'd just like to talk a little bit about your interactions. I've actually, I've already done an interview with Kurt Bench. And this next week, I've got something coming out with Shannon Flynn. I don't know if you know Shannon.
Well, I've met him, briefly at Sunstone, but I don't really know him.
Okay, yeah. So you may be interested. That'll be coming up this week. And then I've also talked to George Throckmorton. He's
I know who George is.
Yeah, so that was a fascinating interview. I'll have that out here in a few months. But so anyway, tell us a little bit about how you became acquainted with Mark.
Well, I'm not sure how soon, where to pinpoint Mark's apostasy, but he went on a Mormon mission in about 76 or something, 75, 76 time frame. And I believe he already didn't believe Mormonism when he went on his mission. Anyways, when he came back, he went up to Weber to college up there. I think he was in pre-med or something. And evidently while he was up there, he bought our book, Mormonism, Shadow or Reality. Now, I didn't know Mark. I mean, he would have just been one of many people that would have contacted us to purchase a book. So he didn't. I didn't remember him. It didn't stand out in my mind. But later in one of his interviews, he said that he had bought our Mormonism book while he was in college up there. And that helped lay the groundwork of the background of his studies for Mormon historical issues. And then he came to see me in 78 or 79. I'd have to look up at the date. And didn't tell me who he was, and I didn't recognize him. I assume he had probably been in the store several times. But one thing you find when you interview people on Mark Hofmann is he didn't stand out. He's not someone you'd remember. He just medium height, medium look, nothing astounding. It wasn't like he was striking in his features. So people tended to not remember him, which helped him in his forgery business because he'd go to buy things different places. And later, when the investigators went to question people that waited on him, they said, well, I don't remember what he looked like, because he was just average and wouldn't have stood out in your memory. So anyways, this young man comes in one day, which we now know was Mark, but I didn't know who that was. He comes in and hands me a photo of a paper that's supposed to be a copy of the second anointing ceremony, temple ceremony. Now, a lot of Mormons aren't familiar with this, but there is a ritual called the second anointing ceremony that's higher than celestial marriage. And only select people get invited to get one of these, and it seals you up to eternal life, short of murder. And so this was something that's discussed in Mormon history circles, who got second anointing ceremonies, what was it, who performed it. And so it was, at the time, it was a very little known ceremony in Mormonism. So this was a big deal to have someone come in and have a photocopy of a document that purported to be from about the 1912 time period from the Salt Lake Temple about the second anointing. And it was a one-sheet thing, and it had a rubber stamp across the side that said Salt Lake Temple, which I assume Mark got made at the stamp company here in Salt Lake. And so here's this document claiming to relate to the second anointing thing. And he brings it in to show me. And so this man, who I don't know, he hasn't told me his name. No, he can't tell me his name because he's from a very prominent family. And when his grandpa died, he was helping his mom clean out the attic, and they went through his papers, and he found this second anointing paper and realized that, wow, this was something he'd never heard about before. And so he didn't show it to the family, and he has this copy, and he wanted to give me a copy, but he couldn't tell me who it was because he was this prominent family, and, so it's all on the QT, So I'm buying this whole thing. And I'm not buying in the sense of paying money. We didn't have it. We had zip money. We never got involved in this documents because we were not in that class of finances. But I realize now he was trying to establish credibility for this piece of paper. And I think by giving me this copy, he assumed I would immediately pass it around to people. And that would raise the value of it because others were talking about it, knew about it, see. And, but I didn't because it had no provenance. I don't know who this guy was. I don't know the name of the family. I well, that's interesting. And I just put it in my file. Well, time went by, and then I had different people call me and say, oh, I understand you have information on the second anointing. Well, I realize now Mark must have been spreading the word around. Well, the Tanners have a second anointing document. You ought to ask them. So Mark knew how to try to make a trail of interest in his documents to give them credibility that there was bigger knowledge of them, so they must be authentic. Well, people would come down and want a photocopy, and I'd say, well, I can give you a copy of it, but I have no background on the fellow. I can tell you what the fellow told me when he brought it in. That's all I know. I don't know the name of the family. I don't know where it came from. All I know is what he claimed. So, buyer beware. Well, I wasn't selling it, but it's up to you what you do with this because I'm not vouching for it. I don't know. This guy just told me this. And so I gave out several copies over the next year to people that I told him, I don't know what this is.
So were you skeptical of the document then initially because you didn't know the provenance?
I didn't know anything about the second anointing. I mean, I didn't know enough to even know how to be critical of it. It was curious, but without any other substantiation to it, I wasn't going to put it out as, okay, here's the deal, So, well, now we know he took it up and sold it to Jeff Simmons, I believe, up at Utah State. Jeff Simmons was special collections head at that time, and him and Mark got to be buddies. And that's where Mark first took up that Bible that had the Salamander Letter, or the Anthon transcript pasted in the pages of a Bible. And this again shows you how Mark was so clever. He glues this phony Anthon transcript in this old Bible, takes it up to Jeff Simmons, says, this is an old part of the Smith family's Bibles, and I just noticed it had the sealed pages. Something's in there. What do you think? Should we open it up? And so he gives it to Jeff. Jeff's the one that unseals these pages to pull out the document. So it isn't Mark finding it. So he's trying to give credibility to this. Jeff Simmons opened the pages and pulled this out. So, obviously it had been glued in there long ago, and well, Mark knew how to play people. So that was the beginning of my adventures with Mark. But then when stuff started to come out in the newspapers about like the Anthon transcript, then I know there's this Mark Hofmann that's doing documents. Well, at the time, I didn't make a connection to the second anointing thing because I didn't recognize the person. From seeing Mark, it didn't ring a bell. Oh, yeah, that's that guy that brought in that document. It just, okay, whole nother event, down the road, here's this guy with these documents. We found out all of this later when the detectives put together the timeline of all his forgeries. And then they come down and were asking me different things, and we started putting together that, okay, that was Mark. So Mark would go around to different scholars and kind of test out his theory of what he was going to invent next. I got the lead on somebody has documents from Brigham Young or Joseph Smith or whatever. And so if I found XYZ dated, 1835 or whatever, what would be some ways that I could think to test to make sure that was authentic? And so then different ones would say, wow, one little known fact is that Joseph Smith wasn't in town that day or was in town that day or whatever, and he'd get different bits of information. So he'd know, okay, what would a scholar look for? I will build that in to my document. So he's making up all this stuff. One of the reasons that people didn't get suspicious of him sooner was he would have different people bring his documents out so that it didn't immediately look like everything came from Mark. Like he has his friend Lynn Jacobs claim to find one of the documents. He sells something to Brent Ashworth, a document dealer, who wants to be the one to announce it and that. So you don't see the pattern. And he was selling things privately to people that never got out in the press. So we didn't see the big pattern of how much he was doing forgeries. If everything had been known, it would have been obvious. In fact, I believe there are collectors today that are holding Hofmann documents that have never come forward. And no one knows of the documents they've bought because they don't want to be known as being duped. So they never came forward. So who knows what's out there of other Hofmann forgeries.
So do you think that these could come, let's say these people die, these documents get passed on, they could come out later and be considered legitimate? Because he was a pretty good forger.
there could be a possibility of a couple things that way, but I would hope that in the Mormon community, ones that got them, I hope that those people have enough integrity to have destroyed or made sure that the thing was marked that this, isn't genuine or something. He made dealings with other people outside the Mormon community on other historical documents, and who knows what kind of people he's dealing with, but I hope in the Mormon community that those that bought some of his stuff will not let that happen, that they'll at least leave information for their family. Don't sell this. or sell it as a Mark Hofmann original, but,
Yeah, I've heard actually there's a market for Mark's forgeries.
Yes, isn't that funny? Not the price that he got for stuff, but yes, there would be a value in just Mark Hofmann stuff. Yeah. So, he was very good at his trade, and part of it was that he didn't impress you as a shyster. It was his very mediocreness that was in his favor, because you didn't think, oh, well, that's a shrewd guy. I better be leery of him. He just didn't give off those kind of vibes. He was personable, believable, but there were signs. Now, not signs that I would have seen, but signs that those that dealt with him talk about. I mean, like, I know Kurt talks about him missing payments, bad deals, and so there were signs that there were, but everyone just passed it off as well. He's a little screwy on his business end of how he handles his business. He can be late on his payments, and if he finds out he's made a bad deal, he'll make it right, and so. But not enough that you would think crook, but enough that you'd think, oh, he's kind of sloppy, not too dependable on payments and stuff. But when the Salamander Letter got rumored, and Mark's the one given the rumors, he would start these rumors around to increase the value of his documents. And so he starts a rumor around that there's this Martin Harris letter that has this screwy take on Joseph's involvement in magic and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, done by Martin Harris. And so we started hearing through the grapevine some of this. And Gerald, different ones, people that he knew that were in the Mormon circle, one of them being Mike Marquardt. I don't know if you've had any place to talk to Mike, but you might.
I know Mike a little bit.
Yeah, you might want to talk to him. But Gerald would say, I've got to see the whole text of this letter, because we'd get snippets of, it says this, or Gerald says, no, I got to see the whole letter to really see, to understand what we're dealing with here. I've got to see the whole letter. Well, we finally got a typescript of the letter. We hadn't seen the document, but Gerald finally got a typescript of it. And in preparing for doing the study on this, when he first started getting the rumors of this letter, he went back and reread E.D. House, Mormonism Unveiled, the different statements by the Smith neighbors.
You say he, is that
Gerald.
Gerald, okay.
Gerald realizes there's a story of a document out there that claims to be by Martin Harris about the magic involvement of Joseph in the coming forth of the Book of Mormon in a magic setting. So he went back to E.D. Howe's Mormonism Unveiled that has statements by the neighbors that all talk about the Smiths' involvement in magic. And so he's becoming more familiar with getting that fresh in his mind, what these affidavits all said. And there had been a BYU Studies article a year or two before that had talked about Joseph Knight, who was an early Mormon at the Smith home at the time of the coming out of the Book of Mormon. And he had read that article. So he was kind of getting prepped up so that on his research ahead of time, so when he gets that copy of the letter, he'd be able to jump right into an evaluation of it. So he gets the letter, the type copy, not the original. And he's reading through this, and the more he looks at it, he says to me, there's something wrong. He said, this has got phrases in it that have to come from E.D. Howe and from the Joseph Knight letters. And so someone's making this up. Now, I don't think he was sure that it was Mark, but someone was making up documents. This is a forgery. And I'm like, Gerald, everyone accepts Mark's documents. I mean, Dean Jesse at the Church Historian's Office is not going to want to accept Mark's documents that are critical of Joseph Smith, that tie him to magic, unless they feel they have to. I mean, why wouldn't they be asking these questions? Gerald says, I don't care. I'm telling you, there's something wrong. The similarities of wording is too much there. So I'm playing devil's advocate, and I said, well, okay, if these all are, the E.D. Howe guys are talking about, Martin Harris told me XYZ, and you got Joseph Knight, when I was there, XYZ happened, Martin Harris said thus and so kind of stuff, you know. Okay, well, why couldn't it be that Martin Harris had a set way of telling his story and used the same phrasing all the time to people when he told the story? And so these all reflect how Martin had formulated a pretty standard way of telling his story. And that's why you get this echo of the same phrases through it. But I know myself, when I retell old events, I tend to fall into certain phrases that I'm used to describe the event to a lot of different people. I've done enough interviews that I know this, that I go back and think, oh, okay, that's the same way I said it in the other one, you know. So I thought, well, this could just be a pattern of he's formulated a way to tell the story. And Gerald says, no, I'm telling you, E.D. Howe statements and Joseph Knight come first. Then you get the Salamander Letter. And I said, why can't it be the other way around? This is just the way Martin always told it, so you see this echo in these documents. Nope. He says, I'm absolutely convinced this Salamander Letter is a product of someone studying Martin Harris. I said, well, the whole world's on the other side. I don't care. Oh, wow. So Gerald gets this preliminary study done up, does a little dollar pamphlet challenging this wording that it looks like it's a lift from these other documents, and sends me up to Sunstone Symposium that they had once a year. Well, they still have them, but at that time they were, I think it was at the Hotel Utah, if I remember right. Anyways, so I go up there and handed this out to different people, critical of, well, not saying that Mark's a fraud, but that the documents got a problem. Well, I have to say, before I went up there with this, I'm telling Gerald, we could get sued. You can't just run around saying something's forgery. Someone's going to sue us. Mark will sue us for defamation or something. And Gerald says, he's not going to sue us. I said, well, how can you be sure? He says, because it's a forgery. He has no background to prove this document. And I, well, please don't lose my house. Okay, so here I'm up passing this little...
So let me just pause for a second there. So the Martin Harris letter had a lot of, as you said, magic in it. And so some might consider that at least critical of the Joseph Smith story. And then you have a reputation of being critical of Mormonism. Yeah. So you've got the Mormon church who believes this anti-Mormon document is legit. And then you've got and I know some people refer to you as an anti-Mormon, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But you've got an anti-Mormon who's questioning the legitimacy of an anti-Mormon document. I mean, does that seem a little odd?
Oh, yeah, it's a man-bite-dog story, which is why we got written up in a lot of newspapers and books later, because Gerald was the first one to be critical. And Gerald said at the time, he says, sure, that'd be great if it was authentic, but I don't want to build my case on anything that's not really historical. That we were already convinced of Joseph Smith's involvement of magic. Well, and all the historians are today. You read any book today. I mean, Bushman's, Joseph Smith Rustone Rolling, he admits all the magic involvement stuff. But at that time, there weren't as many on board with the magic beginnings of Mormonism. And so it was a much more of a shock value for most people to hear about that sort of thing. But Gerald says, it would be easy to build my case on all kind of sensational literature, but I want what I say to be verifiable, that whoever looks at it can say, well, that's the document. Regardless of my feelings, that's what really is the paper trail. And but everybody says it's authentic. Dean Jesse has verified the handwriting. Well, of course, now we know Mark Hofmann had set up the scenario of how they documented the handwriting for Martin Harris, because evidently the church didn't have Martin Harris' handwriting. So Mark had made up several different innocuous Martin Harris things to establish Martin's handwriting. So when they are looking at the Salamander Letter, they're looking at Mark's other Martin Harris documents to verify the handwriting. So it's really crazy.
It's pretty amazing how elaborate some of these scenarios were that Mark did. I mean, he just really did a lot of homework.
Well, I'm not sure how much homework it would take, because there was enough critical material out there that I'm assuming he had his own crisis of faith, did his own research, come to his own conclusions. But I don't know that it was that hard of a research job. I think there were, you had Fawn Brody at the time. You had Our Mormonism, Shadow Reality. There were other critical texts out there that gave you this magic forerunning story to Mormonism.
Well, what I'm saying, though, in my Kurt Bench interview, one of the things that Mark did was he bought a prayer book, as I recall, from Nathan Harris, who was Martin's brother.
Yeah.
And then Mark added something from Martin which was used to authenticate the Salamander document later.
Right.
That seems like just kind of multi-dimensional chess almost.
Right. Well, so then the question was, how early did he decide to make up the Salamander Letter? Had he already envisioned this when he bought the Nathan Harris book? I don't know that he had. He may have just saw the opportunity to buy that with an idea of someday this could be useful for something, and then come up with an idea of how to use it. So who knows how early this all came about, or was it one thing led to another and it just evolved? I don't know. I suppose we'll never know, because you can't trust what Mark says. You have to go on the documents and that to follow the trail, because I'm not sure how far I could trust Mark's reminiscences of his life story. I think he wants to build his reputation of being the world's greatest forger. So he has a vested interest in trying to make it look more grandiose, maybe.
So you think that this was a fairly easy thing to do then?
Well, not easy, but I don't know that he had to. I think, well, let me see. I think Mark had an extremely good memory. I don't know if it was photographic, but, well, like Gerald. My husband had a very advanced memory, not photographic, but he held stuff in his mind. And I think that Mark must have been like that as well, so that when he read stuff, it just sort of stuck. And so I might have to go back and do a lot of research. I'm not sure how much Mark had to do. I don't know how much he just retained the things he read. Mm-hmm. But there was material out there. If you read E.D. Howe and Brody, and then moved up to Shadow or Reality, you got a lot of information just in those 3 books to give you this background of what you wanted to make up to embarrass the church along the way. The reason, I believe, that the church bought into the Salamander Letter, well, one of the things, I believe it fit the scenario that the historians knew was the way the thing happened. They already knew how much the Smiths were involved in magic. And that if you found something by Martin Harris at that early time period, it very well could reflect the magic surroundings of the community and Joseph's involvement in money digging and all. So some of the people writing later about the Hofmann case have implied that Mark was trying to change early church history. No, he was trying to force the church to admit early church history. Because in Mark's mind, he knew Joseph was involved in magic and money digging before he came up with the idea of the gold plates. And so he's trying to force the church to admit this shady beginning of the system, not to make up a story, but to force the church to admit that is the story.
But by doing so, he made up a story.
But he made up a story to do it, yes. But the church already knew about the magic material. I mean, not what Mark was claiming to find, but they knew this was the early story of Joseph's life, was this involvement with the money diggers and the magic, going out at midnight, making magic circles and incantations to bind the spirits that were keeping you from getting the treasure. The church knew that this was the Smith background. So they already were predisposed to believe such a document would be authentic. And then given that Mark had supplied the Martin Harris signature samples to be able to test his document, you can see how easily they were led down the path to accept it as an authentic document. But Gerald, he just had a sixth sense for that type of thing. It was maybe 10 years before this, or maybe around 10 years before this, we had been challenged by a BYU professor, Richard Anderson, on a thing we had done on the first vision, on the three witnesses, and their statements we'd printed a book revealing statements by the three witnesses, and in it we'd had this Oliver Cowdery defense. And Richard Anderson came to our little bookstore one day and challenged us on the historicity of that pamphlet. He says, I don't think you can prove that Oliver wrote that. I don't think you can prove that it ever went back to him.
Oliver wrote what?
Oliver Cowdery supposedly wrote a little pamphlet, a defense in a rehearsal of my grounds for separating myself from the Latter-day Saints. Long title. Anyways, there was this Cowdery pamphlet where he talks about, I think it's the priesthood restoration, that when the angel came, he sounded very much like the voice of Sidney Rigdon. And so this would raise questions about the whole scenario of how the Book of Mormon really came about. Was it a conspiracy of Rigdon and Smith or something, And so here's this BYU professor challenging us that I don't think you can prove the Cowdery defense is a legitimate pamphlet by Cowdery. So Gerald got into a real study of that and finally concluded that Anderson was right. The document, you can't find anyone mentioning the document before around 1900. And it seemed odd that David Whitmer, Cowdery's brother-in-law, wouldn't have mentioned such a pamphlet when Whitmer wrote and addressed all believers in Christ in 1887. That Whitmer didn't mention this, and so we did a lot of research trying to figure out if the Cowdery pamphlet could have been printed at the date it said in the town it said. I went up to the U and did research on printing presses in this town at the time period, and just a lot of minutia. Anyways, Gerald finally concluded that Anderson was right. There's no evidence that the Cowdery pamphlet goes back to Cowdery. In doing that research, he had looked at that on wording in this Cowdery pamphlet, and he noticed that there were phrases in it that were just like phrases in, Cowdery did a series of letters in the Messenger and Advocate, back when he was a faithful Mormon. And Gerald says, somebody used the Cowdery letters from the Messenger and Advocate to make this pamphlet. They've tried to imitate Cowdery's writing style by taking phrases from these letters, although they were in a different context, but the phrasing of Cowdery from these letters to make this document. So he'd already been down this trail before on trying to figure out through analysis of the content of whether it could really be a forgery or something the author would have really written. And so when he looks at the Salamander Letter, he says, these are phrases, it's too pat. There are phrases here that are lifted from E.D. Howe, from this other early book, to make something sound like it's Martin Harris, but it's too pat in the picking up of phrases. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, we're going to get sued and I'm going to lose everything.
I do want to go where you're going here, but let me just make sure. So this, because I'm not familiar with this Cowdery document. So is this another Hofmann forgery?
No, this happened years before Hofmann.
Okay.
It had nothing to do with him. It surfaces around the 1900 time period. And
so this is another forgery, but
it's a forgery
unrelated.
by somebody else, totally
Okay.
unrelated.
Okay.
And Mark probably read our pamphlet on that, I'm assuming.
So you wrote a...
Years before Hofmann, we wrote a pamphlet about someone forging an early Mormon document attributed to Oliver Cowdery that was a forgery.
Oh, okay.
We didn't know who
So
did
you've
it.
never
but
figured out who the forger was?
Gerald had some ideas, and he suggested some minister back east, which got a lot of Christians all shook, that we denigrated this great saint, that he would never have made up this document. And maybe he didn't, I don't know today. But anyways, Gerald had suggested forger, who was a prominent minister at the time.
Do you remember his name by chance?
I think it was Whitsitt.
Whitsitt?
Whitsitt, I think was the name.
Woodsit? Like W-O-O-D?
No, with T's, Whitsitt.
Whitsitt, okay.
I think that was the name.
All right. I'll have to look it up.
We still have the little pamphlet, Cowdery's
Maybe I'll get a copy.
I'll have to give you a copy of Cowdery Defense. But so years before, we'd already written up on where Gerald had analyzed through the content of a document, trying to establish, is this the word pattern that someone would have used? Or is it someone lifting phrases from someone's known writing to make a forgery? So he'd already been down this road. So when he's looking at the Salamander Letter, this follows the same pattern as I saw in the Cowdery document of someone lifting phrases to make it sound like it's Martin Harris, but it's not really. It's not free flowing. It's too contrived with this wording of someone trying to make it sound like Harris would have written something. So I hand that out to people, and then Mark Hofmann comes down to our house after he heard that we'd done this pamphlet.
This is the pamphlet at Sunstone.
Yeah.
At the Hotel Utah or whatever.
Yeah, wherever it was. I think it was Hotel Utah. Anyway, so here comes Mark to our house. Oh, Sandra, I can't believe that you and Gerald, of all people, would be criticizing my documents. Don't you realize that I'm on this roll to get all these Mormon documents out there and everything, and you guys are going to hurt my business and stop no one will want to do business with me, and how can I get all these documents if people think I'm a crook or something, and Mark played to my interest. He was very shrewd on how to play. I'm a direct descendant of Brigham Young, and we've been interested through the years in church finances, Brigham Young's finances, early Utah history and all. So he says, I'm in touch with a descendant of Thomas Bullock. Now, he was a secretary of Brigham Young's. And in the Thomas Bullock papers, there is a lot of stuff about Brigham Young's estate and about his money and his business transactions with the church. And it shows how he was using church money and all this. And so if I get these Bullock collections, wow, you're going to really love to see this, because it's going to have all this stuff about Brigham Young and how he misused church funds and all this. So he's playing to my interest. And we do know that Brigham Young commingled all the funds I mean, this is known by anyone that studies his history. He was, there was just one fund, and then the church and his funds and all were commingled. And so when he died, there was this big problem in settling his estate of how do you divide the monies out? What was the church's and what was Brigham Young's? And so you have this problem, and so there's a big story about the settling of Brigham Young's estate. And so the church trying to be fair to the family, we assume, and so they try to figure out, okay, if he's governor of the territory for so long, he's president of the church for so long, what could we assume over a 40-year period, what kind of money could he have amassed? And so they just come up with a number that, okay, a guy could have legitimately come up with X number of dollars. Everything over that goes to the church. And a few of the kids, of Young's kids, challenged this, and there was a lawsuit over this. And they got some additional, I don't remember now how many thousands of dollars additional from the church into the family coffers, none of which came down as far as my mother. It didn't benefit the descendants any. But anyways, there was already known this controversy over the Young estate and the commingling of funds. So Hofmann's playing to my interest in the Brigham Young deal. It's going to have all this stuff on his using church funds and everything. So you don't want to make any waves on challenging me on my stuff, because then this Bullock family won't want to do business with me because they'll think I'm a crook or something. So, tone it down. You don't want to, you might be the one that stops this acquiring of these important collection of Thomas Bullock. Wow. So he leaves. Gerald came home. I don't remember where he'd been, but he came home, and I said, oh, wow, Gerald, Mark just came in, and he's telling me all about this Bullock collection, and he was saying that you're questioning his documents is going to keep him from getting this collection, and I'm telling the whole sales pitch on the church finances and the Bullock papers and stuff. And Gerald listens to this until I get through, and with this cynical expression, and then he finally looks at me and he says, and I want to sell you a bridge in Brooklyn. And I'm like, what? And he's like, I'm telling you, the guy's conning you. Well, you don't know that. How can you say that? I'm telling you, there is no Bullock collection, So, but Mark had the ability to persuade you, to get you on board of the great discoveries that are about to come out. We're all part of this great effort to bring out the real history and all. So if I'd have had money, he'd have probably been able to have sold me something. But I didn't have any money, so I was not a target of Mark's. He knew we were poor as church mice, so he was just trying to use us as one of many to try to promote the rumor about his documents that would give it buzz in the community to make it credible that oh, wow, there's all this stuff to be found, and Mark's finding it. Different people are finding all these things.
So Gerald was pretty skeptical of Mark by this point.
Oh, absolutely.
Was he kind of a lone wolf there?
Yes. His own wife was opposing him on this, to the point that in one newsletter, we actually had a split editorial in our newsletter when Gerald's giving all his arguments why Mark's stuff isn't legitimate. And then I says, well, you got to at least let me say something to tell people there is another way to look at this. Well, okay, so I have a little part of a page where I tell, these documents have been authenticated by different people, and Dean Jesse's looked at the handwriting, and so I give my little spiel of, come on, guys, there is hope that.
So this is kind of a he said, she said.
Yeah. Well, so later when it came out that Mark was the forger, people said about that issue of the newsletter. Oh, well, the Tanners, they were just trying to play both sides of the street. So no matter how it came out, they'd be heroes, Boy, you don't know. I mean, the discussions we had at the kitchen table were intense. Gerald was so committed to these were forgeries. Wow. And I'm like, the whole world's against you, you realize.
And he didn't care.
No.
Now, does he have a background in history or document examining or anything like that?
No, Gerald was a failure in school. If you looked at his high school records, you would say there is no way this guy would ever end up doing research and writing. I mean, when he went to the University of Utah, and I don't know how he got in, his grades were terrible in high school. I guess it speaks to there weren't many kids going to university from Utah at that time or something that they would even let him go. But he had to take remedial English, which was the best thing that could have happened to him because it spiffed him up on a lot of English stuff he needed to know. But no, Gerald had very bad eyesight. And as a kid, the doctor said his eyes were failing and told his parents not to encourage him to read anything, to don't let him strain his eyes or use them for anything. So he was not encouraged in any way to spend time in books. I mean, his dad was a graduate from BYU. He came from an educated family. The Tanners have been professors at BYU. And, the family line of the Tanners was an educated family, but he was not given encouragement to read at all. Then when he got to be a teen, they finally figured out he needed glasses, but his eyes were so bad that Gerald wore the first contact lens, and I have them over home. They're the size of a quarter.
Really?
Yes, and they cover the whole front half of the eye. I mean, they must have been excruciatingly painful to wear, but the contacts help to preserve his vision. Some way they hold the retina and that in place some way that it was to help it not deteriorate more. So he was not encouraged to be a scholar or to spend time reading. But once he had his faith crisis and that all started when he was 18 and the bishop said it was time to think about going on a mission. Well, he'd been drinking and smoking and carousing around, and so mission. And so then he decided he better figure out if he really believed Mormonism enough to go on a mission. That's what started this whole thing, is his research into that led him to Fawn Brody's book, led him to find out about the reorganized church, led him to find out about the different splinter groups, about David Whitmer's little pamphlet, An Address to All Believers in Christ. And in Whitmer's pamphlet, it's his last public printing statement on Mormonism, Whitmer says that Joseph changed his revelations and that Whitmer was in the room when a lot of the early ones were given. And he says, I know how they were given and they don't read the same, that Joseph's edited them. So that all raised questions in Gerald's mind. He made a couple of pilgrimages to Independence, Missouri to check out the different splinter groups back there. And that launched him into his research. And this is before I met him. And then when I met him, he starts telling me all about his research and gets me into thinking about all these things. We get married and keep pursuing this. I mean, we went up and talked to LeGrand Richards, an apostle, in 1960 about problems with the first vision. And we just hit the ground running, I guess you'd say, as a married couple researching early Mormonism.
So did you get married in the temple then?
Oh, no. When Gerald and I got married, we knew at that point we didn't believe anything of Mormonism past the Book of Mormon. We were persuaded by David Whitmer's pamphlet that Joseph had changed everything, changed all the doctrines, brought in priesthood that wasn't there at the beginning. And so we thought, okay, we can take the Book of Mormon and the Bible and just go with that and scrap the rest of it. So that's where we were at the time we got married. We knew we didn't want a temple marriage.
So you did believe in the Book of Mormon?
Yes, we believed in the Book of Mormon for, we got married in 1959, and we gave up the Book of Mormon the end of the fall of 1962. That as ex-Mormons, we still believed the Book of Mormon for a couple of years there. And our original research was to vindicate the Book of Mormon, that the rest of Mormonism, you can believe the Book of Mormon, you don't have to accept the rest of this stuff. You can scrap Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and all that stuff and just go with the Bible and Book of Mormon. But then we started having people challenge us, well, why would you accept the Book of Mormon? If you can see that Joseph Smith made up the rest of this stuff, what makes you think he didn't make up the Book of Mormon? So then we went into a deep study of American history and American Indian and sources for the Book of Mormon and archaeology and all those things. And so we finally decided, well, there doesn't appear to be any historical evidence for the Book of Mormon as an ancient text. So we can't keep endorsing that. So we set it aside, just went back to being Christians and following the Bible. But then we had all our family, friends, everybody like, so you crazy kids, what are you doing? And that got us into printing because we're trying to explain to our family and friends why we couldn't believe it anymore. And hence developed this whole lifetime of writing and researching on Mormonism. And you were going to ask me about the term anti-Mormon.
Yeah, let's go ahead there. So I asked you, because a lot of people call you an anti-Mormon. What do you think of that term?
I don't like the term because I think it implies an animosity towards the whole group. Like saying you're anti-black would imply against blacks in general. I don't see myself as anti-Mormon. I'm not against the Mormon people. I mean, that's my family. I still have Mormon family that are active. So I don't see myself as anti-Mormon. I'm anti-Mormonism. I don't believe the doctrines or history of Mormonism. I think it shows Joseph Smith was an inventor of the whole thing. So I'm anti-Joseph Smith, if you want to put it that way. But when you say anti-Mormon, I think it raises an image in people's mind of an animosity towards the whole group. And I don't feel that. Mormon critic, I will accept, or critic of Mormonism, sure. No problem with being labeled a critic. But the anti-Mormon to me is trying to make me look bigoted against a whole group of people.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting. So what happened with Gerald?
Gerald in about 1998, I realized he must be developing Alzheimer's. During the 90s, my family, we joked about him being the absent-minded professor. There were just small details of life that just would elude him. And so it's like we all thought he was just so engrossed in his studies that he didn't pay attention to details. It's like I heard stories that Albert Einstein couldn't remember where his umbrella was and stuff like that, So you think, okay, he's just the absent-minded professor. But then one night we're watching a Jazz basketball game on TV, and I think it was must have been the end of the first quarter or start of the second or something, and the score was like 28-32, and the Jazz were down. And Gerald turned to me and he says, "How much are we down by?" And it just hit me. My whole world collapsed at that moment. Gerald was an ace on math. Now, it doesn't show from his school records, but he really was. He could do math in his head just perfectly. And to ask me what the difference was between 28 and 32, everything came together of all those little idiosyncrasies, the not remembering things, the misplaced items, and it all came together at that point. And I thought, oh my word, he's got a memory issue. He's got a problem. This could be Alzheimer's. And I took him to our general doctor, and he just thought Gerald was exhausted and tired, and accepted Gerald's story of, no, it's just stress. I'm good. And so my doctor was saying, no, he's just stressed out. No, I think we got a bigger problem here. And but then different family events came up, my one daughter's marriage, and I knew at that point that it would be obvious to everyone that he had Alzheimer's. Because at the rehearsal for my daughter's wedding, he was supposed to walk her down the aisle, as in a Methodist church, and he was supposed to walk her down the aisle and then hand her off to her husband and go sit down. And the minister's explaining what Gerald's supposed to do and say. Who gets this woman in marriage? Her mother and I do, and sit down. Well, at the rehearsal, by the time he gets up front, he can't remember what he's supposed to do. And afterwards, I told the minister, I says, I'm sure you've realized we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. And I says, all I can say is when the time comes, if he doesn't remember to sit down, I'll just have to come up and get him. I don't know what else to do. And I thought I would have to. We waited. Oh, please, Lord, make Gerald remember to sit down. And we waited several seconds. It was a very awkward pause. And then finally, the minister's trying to motion to him, go sit down, And finally, Gerald came and sat down. But at that point, everyone in the family knew something was wrong. And then there was just a steady decline. He died in 2006, in October 1st. And it was a terrible thing to watch this brilliant mind just melt away. And every day you would realize he forgot something else. And taking care of an Alzheimer's patient is a very hard, long, drawn-out thing. But Gerald was very sweet through the whole thing. Some Alzheimer's patients become very impatient and angry because, nothing in their world works right. They don't understand it anymore. So they think it's everybody else, not them. So some will become very agitated and angry. Gerald never was. He was just the sweetest guy through the whole thing, but he just kept slipping away. And I kept him home clear up until the last week of his life, which was possible because we lived next door to the bookstore here. And between my employees and myself, we were able to keep an eye on him, take care of him, spend time with him and things. And I was able to keep him at home till that last week. He just got so far gone that he had to be in some place. Mm-hmm. But he quit eating, and so in essence, I guess you'd say he starved to death. But that's typical of Alzheimer's patients. They forget to swallow, forget to breathe, forget to eat, whatever. Their body just starts shutting down. So
must have been tough to watch.
That was sad. But then the question was, do I keep the bookstore going afterwards? I was so worn out after taking care of Gerald all those years that I was ready to just bag it. But I kept having people call and want to talk to me and want to help with research, or they want to just have someone to talk to when they were going through their crisis of faith, that I thought, well, I'll keep it going this year. And then I'll keep it going the next year. And here we are 11 years later, and I've still got the bookstore going. I don't know how long that'll be. But anyways, for the time being, I'm still here.
Well, great. Now, so you consider yourself still a Christian, is that
yes,
right?
Yes, I'm a committed Christian.
And do you associate with the Methodists or another church? Or?
No, I go to a local church here in town, Discovery Christian Community. Okay. We would just be a standard middle-of-the-road Christian congregation, just following the Bible.
So, there are some critics of the Bible as well.
Yes.
It sounds like you haven't gone that way, though.
I've read critical material on the Bible. I feel there is sufficient historical confirmation for me to accept the record. I mean, there really are Jewish people that live in Jerusalem, and there really are ancient documents relating to the Bible. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls that show the preservation back before the time of Christ, and we have New Testament documents back into as early as 130 A.D. We have part of the Gospel of John, so that I feel that historically we can show the preservation of the text. And on the New Testament, we are really on strong ground as far as the documents being the earliest record of Christianity. Now, one can say, I don't accept their story. One can say, okay, you could say that that's really what the early Christians believed, but did it really happen? So then it's a matter of faith whether you're going to accept Christ's resurrection. But I believe the documents show the earliest Christians were fully committed to the idea of his resurrection. That's what got Christianity off the ground. It's not an idea that 200 years later is put back in to the system. The earliest documents of Christianity show that conviction of the resurrection to be there. And I believe it's true. And I understand other people look at the evidence, and for them it's not sufficient to continue to believe. So,
well, can I ask you a little bit about that, if I may play devil's advocate? Because I'll tell you what, I believe in the Bible, I believe in the Book of Mormon. So I'm going to play a little bit of a devil's advocate here and try to play maybe a critic of the Bible. Just recently, in fact, just today I released the last episode from Dr. Hugo Perego. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
yeah, the DNA guy.
DNA guy. So one of the questions, or I know some of the critics, like Simon Southerton, has said that, what do you believe about the creation? Because we've had American Indians here in America for 15,000 years, and if Adam and Eve lived just 6,000 years ago,
Well, you're assuming that is a universal belief of Christians on the 6,000-year earth. Granted, many have that position, but there are just as many Christians that accept an old earth. Mm-hmm. So it's not like if you don't believe 6,000 years, you can't believe Christianity. I happen to believe in an old earth. I'm not bothered by the DNA.
So you would say that evolution and the Bible are compatible?
Well, it depends on how you're defining evolution. I believe that it was all God-directed. I believe there has to be a first cause, that I don't think you just have nothing and it springs into being universes and life. I think there has to be something before that. To me, the answer is God. I think that makes more sense than it just all come out of nothing. What do you make the eternal element behind the energy and matter? It seems like there has to be a force before that. It's something that always was there. Okay. And to me, that's God.
So from a scientific point of view, if I understand it correctly, and I'm not an expert on this, but I believe that the Earth is, I want to say, 4.2 billion years old. At least that's the current scientific consensus. Would you accept that?
Yeah, I don't know that they're right on how old it is. I don't know how accurate you can be dating things back into billions of years. But I accept that, yes, it's an ancient Earth. I do not see that as a critical belief, one way or the other, to believe Christianity.
Okay. Let's move on a little bit to the Exodus. I know that there are some critics of the Bible, especially, that have said the Exodus never happened. Moses never existed. We have no archaeological evidence for Moses or an Aaron. Even for a Jew back in that time, from what I understand, the earliest possible record of Jews is about 1000 AD. The Tildan Stele, I think, talks about Syria conquering the house of David. That's the earliest. So if you go back beyond that, the Exodus, Abraham, there is literally no archaeological evidence. So do you believe in a literal Moses, a literal Abraham, the Exodus story? Do you believe those miracles happened?
I have no reason to not believe them. I believe that's believable. So, I don't have a problem with miracles. Now, some people, that's the big hang-up. They can't believe that miracles can happen. I don't have a problem believing miracles. And I don't have a problem believing that there was an Abraham. I accept the Jewish record as representing a history of the people of that time period. Just because something hasn't turned up doesn't mean it wouldn't. And I know the Book of Mormon people would argue the same thing with the Book of Mormon. However, I think that we're at a time period with the Book of Mormon that we have enough evidence to make firmer conclusions on that than you do when you get back to the time of Abraham.
Well, in the Bible, it talks a little bit about, I believe, I'm trying to remember what the exact terminology. I should have looked this up beforehand, but 600,000 people, 600,000 males, which would mean if you count females in there, because they didn't count those back then, that you've got over 1 million people that would have left Egypt and come to Israel. I know that there's been some researchers that have said, look, if you've got 1 million people, they would have left garbage. They would have left some sort of record. They believe, some scholars believe that this is a complete myth, that the Jewish people accepted the myth, that they created this whole myth of coming out of Egypt. There's no we've got lots of records of Egyptians. They don't talk about the Exodus. What do you think about that?
Well, the conquerors get to write the history, and so that the Egyptians wouldn't mention the Hebrews, to me, is not surprising, but so I guess you'd say it's a matter of faith. I just accept that the Jewish history is valid. Now, I don't know that means every number count in the Bible is accurate, because that's all we have to go on. So I don't know. Maybe if you found another record, it might say there were less people in that. I don't know. But I accept the overview of the history as being authentic.
Now, since we're talking a little bit about Mark Hofmann and forgeries, let's talk a little bit about biblical forgeries. Now, there's been a question about the book of Deuteronomy, one of the 5 books of Moses. A lot of scholars believe in the documentary hypothesis. They believe that Deuteronomy does not date from the time of Moses, that it was a later, I want to say Josiah, if my memory is correct, found this book. Now, I remember hearing an interview one time that said that Joseph Smith was kind of familiar with this story about Josiah finding the record, and that the book of Deuteronomy specifically seems to be an ancient forgery, but certainly doesn't date to the time of Moses. Is that something you've studied?
Well, no, I haven't spent a lot of time on that, but I think there's a difference here between saying forgery and writing down the history of a people. Well, I think of, like back when they did the movie Roots, and I don't know if this is a good analogy, but they had to take at face value the memories of the people in Africa of what their family histories were that were never written down. I think you have to realize that in the cultures of those days, history was memory, and everything was passed down through certain people that kept the history of their people. And you learned to recount these stories to preserve your history. So the fact that it's written down later, I don't think proves that it's a forgery. It proves it's a later writing of the tradition of the people.
So would you say that you think that Deuteronomy specifically would have been written by Moses?
I don't know, but I don't know that I'd have to say it couldn't have been.
Okay, so it's a possibility that it could have been written by Moses. Is where you are. Let's talk a little bit about Isaiah. That kind of ties into the Book of Mormon. There are a lot of people that say, Joseph Smith copied Isaiah with biblical scholarship specifically, and I would even say that a lot of LDS scholars accept that Joseph may have taken some of the King James Isaiah as well. But there are some many scholars of Isaiah specifically that say that Isaiah was written by 3 or 4 different. In fact, they call them first Isaiah, second Isaiah, third Isaiah, fourth Isaiah. And so critics of the Book of Mormon say, well, parts of Isaiah that were included in the Book of Mormon were written after 600 BC. They were written after the time that Lehi left Jerusalem. So how could Nephi have had parts of Isaiah that weren't written yet? Where do you fit on that controversy?
Well, I don't think that all the scholars are saying that there were all those parts of Isaiah. Obviously, when you get in the conservative Christian arguments, you would find arguments against the later portions of Isaiah not being contemporary with the writing of the first part of the book. And I would lean towards the more conservative end of that. Regardless, I don't think it gets Joseph Smith off the hook of using a King James Bible for his quotes in the Book of Mormon. I don't think that you solve anything for Mormonism by making a case for the problems of Isaiah. It does make a problem for the Book of Mormon if you can prove that part of it wasn't written until after the Lehi left. I don't know. I don't use that argument because I'm not sure of the reliability of that argument.
So, as I understand, a lot of LDS scholars would say, no, we kind of reject the 4 Isaiah theory. We think that it was all written by Isaiah, and that's why Nephi included it.
But I don't think that solves the problem.
Well, no, I understand. I understand that there's kind of a plagiarism problem that you're talking about. But as far as the argument that the BYU scholars would make that there was just one Isaiah, not 4 Isaiahs, would you tend to agree with?
I would be more to their side of view than the critics' side of Isaiah.
Okay. So, and let's move a little bit on to the New Testament as well. Just probably a month or 2 ago, there was a Radio West interview, and I wish I could remember. I want to say his name is John Spong. I might have the name wrong. He's an Episcopal minister, and I believe he's written a book called Biblical Literalism, a Gentile Heresy. And he has said basically that he does that even though he's a retired minister now, but even though he believes in Jesus, he believes in the Bible, he says that we need to let go of biblical literalism, and he's even been strong enough to say that he believes biblical literalism is destroying the Christian church. He says, I don't believe Jesus was physically resurrected. I don't believe Jesus walked on water. I don't believe Jesus turned water to wine. And I don't need to believe that to be a good Christian. Where do you fit on some of these miracles of Jesus? Do you believe that Jesus literally walked on water?
Yes. I believe all the miracles in the New Testament, and I have no problem with this. I believe I've seen miracles, and I mean, if you come from a position of not believing in miracles, then yeah, the whole thing falls apart. But those of us that believe God believe there's miracles. So I don't have a problem with those parts of the New Testament. And to me, the rise of Christianity makes no sense without the belief in the resurrection. I don't see any reason for the kickstart of Christianity, of the sacrifices and death of all the early Christians, outside of an absolute conviction that the risen Christ had appeared to people that they believed in and were willing to stake their life on.
So you believe that was a physical resurrection,
Yes.
not just a vision of a...
Right, absolutely.
Okay. So, yeah, because I want to say his name is John Spong. I might have the name wrong, but he says that is destroying the Christian church. He says that ancient Jews, the earliest Jews were, or the earliest Christians were actually part of the Jewish sect. And
Well, of course, they're Jews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they didn't make a distinction, and they didn't view the Bible as literally as we do. The stories of turning water to wine. Well, there's a lot of Dionysus, the Greek god, did that routinely, and even Caesar. There's some stories about Caesar walking on water and things like that. And he believes that the ancient Jews borrowed these things, and if you look at the Bible through Jewish eyes, you won't look at these things literally. So my question is, would you, especially when we're talking about the miracles of Jesus, and if you have to believe in the miracles of Jesus walking on water, that makes you a biblical literalist? Would you be comfortable being called a biblical literalist if that's the definition?
Yes.
You would. Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't. So even though you've done all this research on the Book of Mormon, and you don't believe that that's true, why would you? It seems like you have a different opinion on the Bible. Why would? And a lot of people, especially former Mormons, if they throw out the Book of Mormon, they throw the Bible right out. So why haven't you thrown the Bible out?
Because I believe that the earliest records of Christianity show that firm commitment and belief to that story. That was the story of Christianity. Jesus did walk on water. He did rise from the dead. They really believed those things as literal facts in their life experience.
So a critic would say, well, people believe that Joseph Smith really had a first vision, and he saw Moroni. People believe that.
But historically, I think I can show you enough reasons that those events couldn't have happened.
Can't you do the same thing with the Bible?
No,
Not with the resurrection?
No, you do not.
Because we don't have his body.
But you do not have that kind of documentation that we have for Joseph Smith.
Well, but it's also 2,000 years versus 200.
If the Jews could have produced a body, they would have. The early Christians were committed to him resurrecting. Why didn't the Jews produce the body?
Well, there are some Gnostic Christians.
They're later. They don't have any bearing on the actual starting period of Christianity.
Actually, there's a Gospel of Judas. Came out a few years ago. Are you familiar with the Gospel of Judas?
It's later. It's not the time period of the.
Well, and of course, Christians are going to dismiss that as a forgery of Judas, essentially. Yeah. But the interesting story about that, as I have studied that, pretty much everybody believes Judas didn't write this. Yeah. But it does represent a brand of Gnostic Christianity, and there were when Paul talks. And we believe Paul was some of the earliest writings when he talks about other gospels that are preached unto you, and that this is the gospel that I preach unto you, the gospel of Jesus Christ. He's competing with some of these Gnostic Christians that are saying, you know what, in Gnostic Christianity, they believed that a physical resurrection didn't matter, that Judas helped Jesus to shed his mortal body, and they do not believe in a physical resurrection as Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant Christians do. So it does appear to me that there were, especially if you study early Christianity, there were some competing views, even in the days of Paul, that disagreed on even whether Jesus was really resurrected. And Gnostic Christians would reject a physical resurrection.
But why should I accept the Gnostics as being more authoritative? Sure, granted, there were competing views. That's why Paul's writing is to refute that. But the center core of Christianity is refuting the Gnostics. So I don't see why I would accept the Gnostics as having more validity.
Well, I just know that there are some people that like I said, if you're gonna do all this work on Mormonism, why wouldn't that translate over to Christianity as well?
Well, as far as reading, I've read on those issues, and I don't find them valid arguments against Christianity. But as far as writing on it, I haven't gone to Bible school. I haven't learned Greek. I can't go back and evaluate the documents in the original writing. So I don't think that I need to reinvent the wheel of doing research on and writing on the biblical defenses. I think there are books out there that already do that. From professors that have the training and knowledge of the Greek and Hebrew, that would take me a lifetime to have that.
Well, and even tying this back to Hofmann, because a lot of another word instead of a forgery would be pseudepigraphy.
Yeah.
We don't know that Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. Mark wrote the book of Mark. Luke wrote the book of Luke. We have no idea who these authors were. A lot of these early...
Well, I don't know that that's necessarily true. The earliest Christian writers accepted the designations. I mean, they were always known as being written by those guys.
Is that true? Because
I think generally it is.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, they would have lived with Jesus, and if they didn't show up until 100, they would have probably been dead by the time those. Well,
those books I believe were written before the destruction of Jerusalem. I think the Gospels predate the destruction of Jerusalem.
I'd have to double check, but from my understanding, Paul's the earliest.
Liberal scholars would say they were written after the destruction. I don't believe that case. I believe they were written before.
Okay. So, because from what I understand, as far as people critical of the New Testament, let's say, most of the four Gospels would date to after 100 BC, or 100 AD, excuse me.
No.
You disagree with that dating?
No, I absolutely don't believe that, no.
So you think that Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Luke?
I don't know about Matthew, but I believe John wrote John. I believe Luke wrote Luke.
Some people think that John is actually a Gnostic gospel. There's a lot of, in the beginning was the Word was with God. That sounds very Gnostic.
We have part of the Gospel of John from 130 AD. That shows it was an established text around the Mediterranean already that was being preserved. The early writers, except John, I mean, there is not a question of the book of John. So why would I think it's some later text when it's already established at 130? And then in the beginning,
some would argue
Word.
That's the beginning, then, not the end.
Well, no, but it's the fact that doesn't show up at Jerusalem. I forget where they find it at, but because it shows up in a different area, that it's already been established into the church curriculum of acceptance. And we have we have John 1:1 in about 180 AD in a manuscript. In the beginning was the Word. And so with the two manuscripts we have there of John, we establish that it always said the same thing that we have today. There's no evidence that it was ever rewritten. Mm-hmm. I accept that as an authentic document. So, and the earliest Christians accepted it as being John.
Okay. For the record, I'm a believer too. I just thought I would try to ask some of the questions of critics that probably would want those asked.
Okay, read F.F. Bruce on the New Testament. He's one of the best Greek scholars, and he accepts the validity of those records. And I don't know who you're going to find that knows more than him. And Bart Ehrman studied under him, and I don't know how Bart Ehrman got off track because his teacher didn't believe what he's saying.
Well, Bart Ehrman would be a good one. Misquoting Jesus, I think, is one of his.
And I found his book to be, parts of it to be very simplistic arguments that weren't fair and dismissive. Mm-hmm. So I'd rather go with his teacher.
Well, that's interesting. All right. Well, let me just ask you, just as we get ready to finish here, do you have any last comments on Mark Hofmann, or any other stories that we may have missed already?
I thought it was a very curious ending to the whole thing when the prosecutors negotiated a settlement with Mark rather than having the thing go to trial. Now, the question was, if they took it to trial, how many trials would there be? because the prosecuting attorneys said that if they would have gone forward, there would have been a trial on the documents, but they couldn't prove a connection from the documents to the motive for the murder. And that if they had to do the murder separate, that they were afraid they'd lose because they wouldn't be able to prove a connection up for the motive to the forgery of the documents. And I talked with, Stott, the prosecuting attorney, about this afterwards one day. I don't remember, I ran into him at some kind of history thing. And he asked me what I thought would have been their chances of a conviction if they'd have gone forward. And I said, well, I'd have gone forward because, I think you could have nailed the guy on every count, But because they were convinced that there would have to be a division of the trials on the different forgeries and the murderer, that it would be hard to get the death sentence. And if you're not going to get the death sentence, then isn't it better to negotiate a settlement where he has to fess up to everything and get that cleared off the table and give him life? Well, he wasn't actually given life. It was, 15 to life or whatever.
I think it was 5 to life.
5 to life.
Yeah.
Of course, then Mark gets in prison and he makes some stupid move to try to hire a hitman to kill the parole board. I mean, hello, that just sealed your fate. You're never getting out of here, buddy. It was just crazy. I don't know why he would have done that, but anyways,
he'd been getting away with stuff for a long time. I guess he thought he'd get away with that too.
Right. I went to the whole preliminary hearing for the month-long sessions, and it was fascinating to hear. It was fascinating to hear how they had pulled all the evidence together on the case. I ended up feeling that they didn't want to really go forward with a trial because Stott was a devout Mormon, and he would know that it's not kosher to put all the general authorities on the stand in a court case. And several of them would have been called. Hinckley had personally done business with Hofmann. You had, who was the other guy that did the loan?
Hugh Pinnock.
Pinnock. And I don't remember who else met with Hofmann. So you have these different men that would have had to have been put on the stand. Well, I think a good Mormon would know that wouldn't be a good career move to be the one that subpoenaed the church leaders. And the question would come up then, do you subpoena church finances? If you're going to deal with who paid who for what, does this get into revealing church finances? Which would have been a big problem for the church. They never let any information out about their finances. It would all come out about this loan of Pinnock's that would have, who knows what rabbit trails that could have gone down. So I think that intuitively a good Mormon would have known, we better figure out a way to get this thing cleared off the table before we do any more damage to the reputation of the church. So I was disappointed they didn't go forward with the trial.
And I think a lot of people were disappointed with that.
Yeah.
Now, couple interviews. Maybe I'll hopefully pique your interest here. So Shannon Flynn, I'm going to be releasing that next week. He's actually talks a lot about that loan with Hugh Pinnock, and he. So there'll be some interesting things coming out there. Also, George Throckmorton, I've interviewed him as well. Interesting to hear his police side of it. I do remember in the book Salamander. That the Stott that you referenced, he had a reputation even before that trial of settling cases.
Yeah.
He and in talking with George Throckmorton, there was because I want to say Cannon was the district attorney or something like that. He was going to prosecute it, and then he got out of the case, and I don't remember if Stott took over or whatever, but there was some. I believe it was in the county attorney's office. There was some turnover there, And the person who replaced Cannon, I can't remember his name, said something to the effect of, look, we're spending way too much money, because it takes a lot of money to figure out if something's a forgery. We're going to cut the budget. I know George Throckmorton knew he was losing his job, which was going to cut the case. So there were some other things going on. I don't think it's fair to say, I mean, not that I disagree. I'm sure that Stott didn't want to call President Hinckley to the stand. I'm not disagreeing with that, but there were a lot of factors, and I don't think it's fair to say, well, he's a Mormon and he wanted to avoid publicity. Sure, that's true, but there there's a
yes,
spending
there
a
would
lot
have been
of money.
other reasons too.
There's a lot of other issues going on there. So
right.
So I think those are important to consider as well.
Yes.
So, and hopefully those will help you all listen to those interviews. They're fascinating interviews. So anyway, was there any other things on Hofmann that you
Well,
wanted to
it's
mention?
curious that he's never talked to anyone and granted interviews on it. But if you get the reputation of being the world's greatest forger, anything you say or do after that may diminish your status. So I could see why he wouldn't want to. Once you make it to the top, you quit talking. So I think that he has selfish reasons for not wanting to ever grant an interview of taking away. What else has he done in his life? His only claim to fame is to be the greatest forger. So if he doesn't talk, they can't analyze it anymore and take away from that.
Well, and George Throckmorton said, no, the greatest forger was never caught.
That's true.
So very interesting. All right. Well, thank you, Sandra Tanner. I really appreciate you taking some time and your reflections on Mark Hofmann. And thanks for interviewing with Gospel Tangents.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Sandra Tanner. Sandra, it was super fun doing it. And you know what? We decided to do it again. And so I went on Friday night to Sandra's house. Sandra and Gerald had actually joined Pauline Hancock's church. Now, Stacey Cram recently was the first female prophet of the Community of Christ. Pauline Hancock was one of the first female leaders of a Restoration church. And so I'm going to talk to Sandra about that in our next interview. But I have some pictures here. I asked Sandra if she had some pictures of Pauline, and I knew I wasn't going to remember this, so I recorded her describing these pictures. And this is part of the conversation that we're going to talk about on our next episode.
This is in 1959, Christmas greetings they sent to Gerald before let's see. If it's Christmas of 59, it'll be after we got married then. And so this is Pauline's photo at that time.
Okay. So you said this was a picture, Church of Christ.
This is in the basement. It's called the basement church.
Okay.
They never got around to building the top on it. It's since been built on top of, and is some other church restoration group. But this was in the basement of the church. Pauline's on this side.
On the right.
And I believe Gerald's in there somewhere, but you can't tell from the photo.
Okay.
The Wilcox family here became the leaders of the church when Pauline died. And so Mr. Wilcox, his wife Olive back here, and Gerald here.
Okay.
At the Wilcox home when we were out there in 61.
Okay. Out there in Independence?
In Independence, Missouri, yeah.
And then, let's see, so
this is in Salt Lake City.
Is in Salt Lake City. The woman in the back,
is Pauline. And then this is Olive Wilcox here, who and her husband took over after Pauline died. And Barbara Wilcox, her and her husband were pillars in the church back there. And that's my daughter, April, that she's holding.
Okay. Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.